Good afternoon. I'm Eva Hoffman, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing this session on medieval identities and beyond. This session is about collaboration in every sense. It brings together medievalists from the International Center of Medieval Art and historians of Islamic art to explore issues of cultural exchange in the realms of European, Byzantine, and Islamic art, and to share multiple perspectives of scholars in these fields. So I want to express my thanks both to the International Center of Medieval Art and to the historians of Islamic art for sponsorship. And I also have here a very lovely invitation to become a member of the International Center of Medieval Art. I know most of you here are members of Historians of Islamic Art, so this is an opportunity to expand your horizons, our horizons. So it is a testament to the fact that we have this sponsorship of the International Center of Medieval Art that issues of crossing boundaries, dismantling hierarchies, and cultural exchange are becoming central to the scholarship, and in many cases are replacing the old taxonomic categories. Exhibitions, such as the recent one here at the Met, Byzantium and Islam, are debunking notions of cultural bifurcation and instead bringing material together to provide a more holistic framework in which to consider meanings and functions of art, resulting in a richer understanding. The premise of this session is that an interactive exchange between medieval scholars specializing in different areas offers both a creative and a focused approach to exploring this notion of intersection. So we have two pairs of specialists in European, Byzantine, and Islamic art who have each worked and taught together in the past, and they've had many thoughtful conversations together about this material. There's Amanda Leister and Mika Natif at the College of the Holy Cross, and Didi Ruggles and Bob Osterhut at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. Now, some of these folks have moved on, but this is the moment where they had their intersections. And I should say that Bob Osterhut and Didi Ruggles hosted a conference at Champaign-Urbana and edited a volume together, Encounters with Islam, the Medieval Mediterranean Experience. So all of these people have been thinking about this exchange for a long time. Now, each pair of scholars has chosen shared works and themes that appear across their disciplines. By looking closely, each paper will shed light on the particular context of the studied works. By looking widely, the papers collectively will allow us to consider these works within their broader global contexts. Through these collaborative efforts of close study and wider perspectives, it will be possible to follow the trajectory of the life of the works as they move through time and space. The consideration of these works through these multiple contexts will further raise broader questions of the role of art in framing and reframing culture, which will ultimately lead us toward a fuller and more integrated understanding of medieval art. Now, I encourage you to think about the papers relationally and in dialogue. We will have questions after each pair of talks. When you ask your question, I invite you to direct your question to both scholars in each of the pairs and to share in this collaboration. And before we begin, we at the panel, members of the panel, would like to dedicate this session to Maria Rosa Menocal, who passed away at the beginning of the week. Our first speaker is Amanda Leister, who received her PhD from Harvard University and has been teaching since 2006 at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. She studied the art and architecture of medieval European and sometimes the Islamic world, and her work in these areas has appeared in journals such as Medieval Encounters and Word and Image, as well as exhibition catalogs and anthologies. Amanda is the co-editor with Alicia Walker of the volume Negotiating Secular and Sacred in Medieval Art, Christian, Islamic, Buddhist, and it was published by Ashgate in 2009. Thank you, Amanda.
The Kalila wa Dimna, popular in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, among other languages, is a collection of animal fables embedded in a frame tale. Buzoya, the narrator and traveling physician, leaves the 6th century Sasanian court to discover a life-giving herb in India. He finds the herb is actually a book of animal fables delivering lessons on human behavior and politics. Here I show a fairly typical image of Buzoya at court. Mika Natif will address this image later. If this is typical, let me show you Buzoya in Paris Bibliothèque Nationale Latin 8504, completed in France in 1313. In the illustrations of this Latin translation of Kalila wa Dimna, Buzoya, the Persian physician, has a vision of Christ, dreams of God, and sees himself miraculously in the company of the Virgin and her infant son. To a modern reader, this Christian twist is highly unexpected in a tale told by a Persian narrator, which largely takes place in India. Yet surprisingly, Buzoya's conversion to Christianity, for, as I'll show, that is what is represented here, has never provoked more than a brief mention in scholarly literature. In this paper, I analyze the manuscript's construction of Christian identity, and in turn, I explore how that construction might reflect on other non-Christian identities. I also examine the role of personal relationships in shaping religious identity. Although no scholar has yet analyzed the conversion sequence, literary scholars have determined the work's textual antecedents, and art historians have focused their attention on the 2 prefatory folios. These represent the earliest historical depiction in France, showing the French royal family participating in the events of Pentecost 1313. The remaining miniatures, about 140, all relate to the animal stories in Kalila wa Dimna. One of the few essays to address the manuscript's text and image treats it as a metaphorical statement of French empire over Islamic cultural domains. In Kinoshita's 2008 essay, the manuscript is included alongside other translated manuscripts that were executed as part of large translation programs undertaken at the behest of a ruler. At one level, this argument makes sense, since the Kalila wa Dimna was a popular tale in Islamic lands, and it was patently translated into Latin with beautiful images of the French royal family in the prefatory folios. Yet there are some problems. This text was not accomplished as part of a larger translation program. It was a one-off commission. Nor was it requested by the reigning French king, Philip the Fair. Rather, the French queen, Joan of Navarre, requested its completion from the otherwise unknown physician, Raymond de Béziers. Her other commissions include other cultural works, most addressing moral behavior and right rule, indeed the very theme that undergirds Kalila wa Dimna. Furthermore, in the French manuscript, the association between the tale and its substantial Islamic heritage is minimal. The language of the source material is repeatedly named as Spanish, and indeed the translator did use a Spanish version. Although the phrase, the Book of Kalila and Dimna, is used in the text, Raymond specifically states that his book, which contains many editions, is entitled the Liber Regius, the Book of the King. Kalila was not well known in France at this time, and the majority of French readers could not have been aware of its origins. Given its unique circumstances of commission, an altered title and a Spanish language source, and given, moreover, the fact that very few readers would have known of this text's Islamic heritage, how can this manuscript operate as a statement of Christian empire over Islamic realms? I suggest we re-examine the ways in which religious identity is negotiated within its pages. 3 sections of the manuscript are relevant to the construction of Christian and possibly Muslim identity. These are first, the prefatory pages in the frontispiece, which depict the French ruling family. Second, the introductory text, which describes the translator's aims. And third, the lengthy section in which Bezoya converts to Christianity. When these three sections are considered together, they generate three conclusions. First, perhaps surprisingly, this manuscript does not present an explicit Christian-Muslim binary. This is an important proviso to keep in mind when reading interpretations informed by the East-West or Christian-Muslim binary of Orientalism, like that of Kinoshita. Here, my conclusions dovetail with recent concerns about the usefulness of Said's binaries as voiced by other scholars, including the two final speakers in this panel, D.D. Fairchild Ruggles and Robert Osterhout. Instead, in this manuscript, the world's either Christian or not worthy of being named. Muslims, Jews, or those of other faiths are not named. Second, within the story, religious identity can change, but only in one direction, thus ensuring the eventual triumph of the Christian religion and nations. While we today might support a transcultural interpretation of the medieval world, as argued by Flood and others, the maker of this text would have denied such a possibility. Third, religious identity is bound up with personal relationships, both in heaven and on earth. The first of the three manuscript sections encompasses the two prefatory folios and the first page of the manuscript proper. The miniatures on the two prefatory folios have been called the earliest historical depiction in the medieval West, since they represent the events of the week-long celebration of Pentecost 1313, just before the book's presentation. The celebration focused on the knighting of Philip the Fair's three sons and the subsequent taking of the cross, that is, vowing to go on crusade to the Holy Land, by royalty and commoners. The first miniature shows the knighting of Philip the Fair's eldest son, Louis of Navarre, King Edward II of England, Philip's son-in-law through his daughter Isabel, is ceremonially belting Louis, and Philip the Fair himself gives the ritual slap. The next miniature shows the subsequent belting of others, including Philip the Fair's two younger sons. Much was made of the fact that three kings were present. You can see the three writing in the third image here, the kings of France, Navarre, and England, although usually the miniaturist makes it clear that the king of France is preeminent here by making him the tallest. We're next shown the three kings taking the cross, and in the center is the Pope's emissary. And aside here, Philip the Fair never actually fulfilled this vow. It's in this image, however, that the presence of the Islamic world is most strongly evoked as a nameless, faceless military enemy. The final image on this folio shows the presentation of the manuscript. Mika Natif will expand on the elision in such scenes between contemporary and glorious past courts. The first image in the manuscript proper is the family portrait of Philip the Fair, his daughter, Queen of England, his son, Louis of Navarre, his other two sons. Presented then through these initial folios are the members of an extended family, who between them represent three nations, England, France, and Navarre. Their Christian identity is underlined as a common bond in the sacred ceremony of knighting and in the taking of the cross. The senior position of the French king, Philip the Fair, is also emphasized, and his role as engenderer of kings and as the head of a Christian royal family stretching beyond geographical boundaries and across multiple nations is suggested. The second aspect of the manuscript I examine is a textual passage, just following the frontispiece, in which the translator, Raymond, discusses his manuscript. He writes that he's added so many proverbs, verses, and other authorities that although the book he translated from was called Kalila wa Dimna, his new book should be called the Liber Regius, or Book of the King, and he hopes that the king and others may be instructed by it. And indeed, Raymond did add so much new material to the Kalila wa Dimna from classical, Christian, and grammar school traditions that he nearly doubled its length. The textual source is repeatedly specified as Spanish language. At one point only is a partially correct history of the tale's translation through many languages given, from the language of the Indians to Persian to Arabic to Hebrew, in which form the tale's brought to Toledo, where it's translated into Spanish, the tale's then carried to Navarre, and finally to France. The book's long and influential history in the Islamic world is referenced here only in the single word Arabitum, a misspelling of Arabicum, or Arabic. The new and highly Christianized manuscript which opens with an invocation to the Trinity, is presented with a new title and additional material, suitably Christianizing the tales of the Kalila Wadimna. In a similar manner, the narrator of the frame tale, Berzoia, converts to Christianity. The conversion sequence, which is the lengthiest single edition made by the translator, provides our third and final focus. Raymond makes it explicitly clear that Berzoia converts to, quote, the Catholic faith, although which faith Berzoia converts from is never mentioned. Raymond inserts many pages here of text copied from Alain of Lille's 12th century Anti-Claudianus, a classicizing treatise on faith, hope, charity, the senses, and God. The first miniature in this section shows Berzoia meeting with Anushirwan, then traveling. In both these images, Berzoia wears the robe of a physician and a flat cap. After 5 pages of text, Berzoia appears in the long beard and robes of an ascetic or holy man. He falls to his knees before Christ, in a flash recognizing his divinity. Apparently exhausted by this experience, Berzoia then falls asleep. He's then granted a vision of God in heaven, surrounded by 9 legions of angels, as the rubric states, or at least 2, as the illuminator seems to have decided would be easier to draw. This vision is more sophisticated and theological in nature. God, stern and powerful, appears from the heavens, holding the globe of the earth, the orbis mundi. This vision is not a personal discovery of faith like the first. Rather, it reveals the deepest nature of God, that he is the creator and the ruler of the universe. This is just one example of many in which the artist has decided to ignore the rubrics, focusing instead on a highly personal relationship between Berzoia and God, or Berzoia and Mary. The last 2 images in this section are devoted to the Virgin Mary and Christ as a child. The first image serves as a visual encapsulation of the Virgin's history, including the Annunciation, where, as a maiden, she wears a red robe and is astonished at Gabriel's news of her divine conception. She appears again to the right in a violet robe, having given birth to the tiny Christ child. Now she is the Queen of Heaven, wearing a crown. This second Virgin of the violet robe and crown is depicted again in the final image in this group. This is to be read as the capstone. Berzoia is vouchsafed an audience with the Queen of Heaven. No longer is the divine only a vision in the sky. Berzoia now occupies the same small space as the Virgin and her child. Berzoia kneels at her feet, looking up in adoration. And the child, now older and more alert, blesses the Reverend Berzoia. The relation between the two is active, engaged, alive with energy. This intimate moment caps the preceding series of images, modeling conversion as occurring first through textual learning, then being vouchsafed a glimpse of divinity, then engaging with a deeper understanding of the history of the universe and God's role in it, finally culminating in an intimate, personal relationship with the divine. In the last image in the series, we're given to understand that forever Jesus has blessed Berzoia. This emphasis on the process of conversion, of an identity slowly developed through time, effort, and divine grace, is rarely so fully depicted in medieval art. This long process of conversion relates well to recent theorization of pre-modern identity and its contingent and unstable nature. Identity can change. Berzoia can transform himself into a Christian. Arabic can change to Hebrew, to Spanish, to Latin. The Kalila Wadimna can become the Liber Regius. Once it has been admitted that identity is mutable, the reader might imagine that he or she is entering the realm of the transcultural, in which both transmitter and receiver culture are always already hybrid. Yet in this manuscript, such a possibility is emphatically denied. For Raymond, Berzoia, once Christian, will always be Christian. The new knowledge Berzoia has internalized, the visions he's seen, the blessings of the Christ child, these are not things that can be undone. The possibility of change in religious identity, but change in only one direction, as outlined in this image cycle, can also be explored in the accompanying text, which the translator took from the Anti-Claudianus. Probably the most influential part of that text is a prayer known as the Summa Parens, which, due to its popularity, circulated independently. That prayer appears just after the first appearance of the converted Berzoia and focuses on the slow perfection of form. God invests the old mass, complaining of the ugliness of its appearance, with a better raiment, and, marking with the stamp of form, removes the disturbance. Shine thou upon me with divine light, and rain upon, cleanse the marks of shame from my soul, and, cutting away, dispel the shadows, and make me serene in the splendor of thy light. God stamps the old mass, which is ugly, with new form. He cuts away the shameful parts. These metaphors of the stamp and the sculptor invoke processes which create beautiful form from a previously imperfect mass and which are not easily reversible. A stone, once cut, stays cut. These pieces, these souls, are Christian and will not change again. In this prayer, too, the source of the raw material, souls or fables, is unimportant. Perhaps this is why so little attention is focused on origins, on Bezoya's or the Kalila Wadimna's pre-Christian identity. And perhaps, too, this is how we're meant to understand another conversion. This is a conversion that is only speculation and may never have taken place. However, it's been suggested that the translator, Raymond de Béziers, was Jewish. He was a physician who knew Spanish well, from a city in southern France known for its Spanish émigrés and Jewish population. Raymond completed his manuscript in 1313. Just a few years before, in 1306, Philip the Fair had seized the property of all Jews and expelled them from France. Might Raymond have recently converted to Christianity to avoid such a fate? Might his efforts reveal a deep-seated anxiety about whether he could be accepted by the Parisian court, where enacting a Christian identity was an essential part of a successful career? It's in this context that I return to our three conclusions. First, the manuscript as a whole does not construct an explicit Christian-Muslim binary. The text passes over the entire Islamic cultural heritage as quickly as one can say Arabitum, Sikh. The prefatory pages invite comparison between Christians and their faceless enemy, presumably Muslims, but recall too how many crusaders attacked Christian targets. Indeed, Philip the Fair had been knighted in the context of a crusade against Aragon, of all places. Muslims are not presented as a constructing and organizing principle. They are erased and elided, certainly a form of domination, but the same applies to Jews, Hindus, and those of other non-Christian faiths, none of whom are named. Second, this manuscript constructs identity as mutable. That is, religious identity can change, but only in one direction. The Anti-Claudianus articulates such change using the metaphors of stamping, sculpting, and perfecting form. Such a framing for conversion implies that as time passes, more and more people will become Christian, and the power of Christianity will only ever increase. Yet, the establishment of empire in any consistent practical or political way does not seem primary here. Philip the Fair never goes on crusade. This manuscript is not commissioned by a king, but rather a queen. It's not part of a large translation program, but rather a one-off request. In the end, this manuscript seems importantly personal. This brings us to our third conclusion regarding the role of personal relationships in shaping religious identity. Personal relationships were essential not only in the celestial court, as in the images of conversion, but also in the earthly court in Paris, as in the prefatory cycle. We might view Latin 8504 as a personal token intended to establish a personal relationship. The queen died before Raymond had completed his commission. Raymond instead must offer his work to an unsuspecting king. This is Raymond's way of enacting a French Christian identity, as the kings and princes parade their Christian identities through the ceremonies of knighthood and crusade. Raymond couldn't be knighted, and although he could take a crusading vow, who would record it? However, he can create a text which presents a significant Christian moment, a conversion, and which integrates Christian learning into every page. His presentation of that manuscript, depicted here, acts to initiate a conversation in the Christian language of the Parisian court. On a final note, I propose an alternative reason why this translation might have been commissioned. Rather than, in the first instance, an attempt to show French dominance over Islamic culture, I suggest that the Queen was actually interested in the material in the Kalila Wadimna. She had commissioned other texts addressing right rule and social behavior, and moreover, both at court and among the bourgeois, there was a vogue for thinking about political and social behavior in terms of animals. The 1313 festival at Pentecost is quite marked in this respect. Alongside tableaux vivants from Christian scripture, there were a number of similar scenes from the life of Reynard the Fox. The king's minister, upon his downfall in 1315, is called a Reynard. And the king himself was described in 1319 by a critic as a pig who always wanted to be near his wife, therefore timid and ineffective. Animal tiles provided a way of categorizing and analyzing human behavior, sometimes used as political satire. Raymond describes these tales as science. One could imagine, in a perfectly harmonious world, individuals from many lands and religions debating on the human truths revealed in animal stories. Unfortunately, medieval France was not that harmonious world, and in order for the tales of Kalila Wadimna to be accepted, their identity had to be stripped, and the tales, just like their narrator, Berzoya, converted. Thank you.
We'll now have Kalila East with Dr. Mika Natif, who received her PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts in 2006 and is now Assistant Curator of Islamic and later Indian art at Harvard Art Museums. Her primary fields of research is Islamic painting, with a special interest in Central Asia, Iran, and India in the post-Mongol era. She has written a number of articles on Islamic book arts and visual culture. Her current book manuscript, Mughal Occidentalism, explores the intercultural and artistic exchanges between India and Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. She is also the co-editor and co-author of the forthcoming volume with Francesca Leone, and the title is Eros and Sexuality in Islamic Art, coming in by Ashgate in 2013. So now we have Kalila East and Mika Natif.
Before I start my talk, I would like to recognize the tremendous research work on Kalila and Dimna subject by some colleagues who are present here today. Bernard O'Kane, Eleanor Sims, Julian Raby, I don't know if you made it here. Others are with us in the spirit. I stand on their shoulders. The Book of Kalila and Dimna is a remarkable document about the history of contacts between civilizations. The text is a collection of stories with moral lessons where animals and humans act and interact with one another. Starting in India, the text moved freely between Indo-Iranian and Semitic languages. It was transported to Sassanid Iran, and then to the Muslim world, and from there to Europe, as we've seen with Amanda's talk. My paper today focuses on an illustrated manuscript of a Mughal version of the Kalila and Dimna stories. Through its text and illustrations, I will explore themes related to the awareness of translation, assimilation, and the formation of self-identity in a multifaceted society. But before plunging into all of that, I would like to introduce briefly the history of the Kalila and Dimna tales. Based on the Sanskrit text of the Panchatantra, the stories became well known in their Arabic and Persian translations, and numerous manuscripts were also illustrated. Among these medieval texts, the Persian rendition of Nasrullah became popular also in the Indian subcontinent. Later on, the Timurids had their own Persian recension of the Kalila and Dimna, known as the Anvari Suhaili. It became so prevalent that during Akbar's reign, at least 5 manuscripts were copied and illustrated. But the Mughals were not content with the Timurid version of the text. Looking to simplify the florid Persian language of the Anvari Suhaili, Emperor Akbar commissioned his minister and historiographer Abul Fazl to rewrite the Kalila and Dimna tales. This latter rendition was entitled the Iyari Danesh, or the Stone of Wisdom. Completed in the 16th century, the core stories in Abul Fazl texts were based on the Arabic medieval narrative of Ibn al-Mukaffa. The Mughal author further states in his preface that the Islamic fables can be traced back to an Indian source, thus indicating his awareness of history and place. The Iyari Danesh was illustrated few times during Akbar's period, And my talk today will focus on one specific copy dated to 1005 in the Hijri, which is 1596-97 by its colophon. And you see a spread of the paintings from this manuscript on the screen. This book was produced in Lahore, which was the Mughal capital at the time. It consists of 25 paintings, most of them full-page illustrations made by artists of the Royal Atelier. Illustrated manuscripts of the Kalila and Dimna stories have often been considered to function as textbooks for the education of princes. Abul Fazl's version was written with this didactic purpose in mind. Each chapter summarizes a section of the original text. However, the illustrations in the Iyari Danesh seem too sophisticated and complicated to be aimed solely at the education of the young elite. The manuscript's text and images place the exotic fables within more familiar territory. The Mughalization of all figures, their physical setting, geography, flora and fauna of India, the recording of Mughal court rituals, and historical individuals of the Akbari milieu. The Mughal assimilation of Kalila wa Dimna can be seen manifested through the visual engagement with India, its landscape, and the representations of animals. Although some scholars have argued that in Kalila and Dimna illustrations, the depiction of animals was more stable and they did not demand the same constant adaptation to contemporary fashion as the depiction of humans did, in our Iyari Danesh, we see a newly kindled visual experience. And I'm bringing this, the manuscript that was made for Sadiki back as a comparison, and just look at the way the animals are rendered in the Safavid versus the Mughal version, and just look at the dates and see that they're just a few years apart. Think about the landscape, how the landscape is rendered in terms of place and locale, and also relationship to the body. And another comparison that I would like to make is to the Jalairid manuscript. Here the artist is very much interested within details of the animals, but you see again the difference between the kind of encyclopedic study and meticulous study of the natural world of India, the landscape, the specific plants, etc., versus a much more imaginative, creative landscape in the Jalairid section. So we see here a much more zoological study that is more related to what we read in texts like the Baburnameh's kind of systematic methodology of categorizing and thinking about the environment. I'm just showing you a detail of the animals to show you that we can really identify Bengali tigers, leopards, all kinds of other specific species that are indigenous to India. In the depiction of the Court of the Lion King is represented sitting under a banyan or Bodhi tree, a sacred tree related to Krishna, Shiva, and the enlightenment of the Buddha. Linked to deep introspective moments, Akbar, on the image on the right, is shown making important decisions when he sits under the Bodhi tree. Similar to the Mughal emperor sitting on his throne, the lion is elevated on a natural stone platform. You can see the similarity between this area here and here. And there is also a peacock above the royal feline, hence the association is clear, and I'm going to show you a detail. And just to remind you that these two are from the same manuscript. Can you see the peacocks? The illustrations in the Iyari Danesh are also very conscious in articulating how the Mughal perception of history, the recording of time, and self-awareness defined identities in the paintings. For that purpose, I chose to focus on two images: the opening picture of Borzoya presented before King Anushirwan, and the closing miniature showing the calligrapher Abdelrahim Haravi and his assistant. The illustration cycle in the Iyari Danesh commences with the presentation scene linked to the history of the text. The physician, Borzoye, who was sent on a mission by the Sasanian king Khosrow Anushirwan, Khosrow I, has returned from India and brought back with him the secret book of wisdom and knowledge, the book of Kalila and Dimna. We are told that the rulers of Hindustan kept this manual of statecraft concealed and do not show it to anyone. After Borzoya gained their confidence, he was able to access the much coveted body of knowledge and translate it into Pahlavi. Attaining the object of his mission, upon his reappearance at the court of Khosrow I, our physician presents him with the book of Kalila and Dimna, while the king orders a grand celebration for the event. So this is our physician, this is Borzoya, and this is, of course, Khosrow I. The painting before us is fascinating on numerous levels. Through the use of portraiture, it links two different courts that existed in different places and times, that of the Mughals and the great king Khosrow I. And it induces the notion of keen awareness regarding the transmission and mediation of knowledge. By visual means, the scene of the Sasanian ruler receiving his physician is immediately translated into Mughal terms. Every detail in the setting reflects the environment of the Mughal court. Hence, architecture is rendered in a typical red stone with its detailed carving and masonry work. Grand carpets are spread on the ground. The lavish textiles decorate the side areas of the pavilion. Moreover, the lushness of the gold objects on the floor, the various hunting animals, the musicians at the bottom, and the numerous persons clad in bright-colored robes who are animatedly gesturing and talking to one another, all come together to bring forth the exhilaration of the moment and the abundance of the court. At the same time, the scene is disorienting, with the only stable element being the figure of the ruler sitting on his golden throne, elevated and somewhat isolated from the crowd. The physician who approaches the royal seat displays incisive knowledge of Akbari court etiquette. When Borzoya appears before King Anushirwan, he performs the Corniche salutation, in which, and I'm quoting from the Ain Akbari about court regulations, the person has to have the palm of the right hand placed upon the forehead and the head to be bent downwards, end of quote. Another official is shown performing the taslim, which is described in the Ain Akbari as placing the back of the right hand on the ground and then raising it gently till the person stands straight. Now I'm referring to this guy here. And according to Abul Fazl, Akbar is credited with inventing these ritualistic gestures. In earlier illustrations of the same scene, such as in the Jalairid manuscript of Kalila and Dimna, our physician Borzoya is depicted performing the Zamin Bus, kissing the ground, where he prostrates in front of the Sasanian king, as Bernard O'Kane states. Moreover, in these illustrations, Borzoya appears like a Muslim scholar wearing a green robe, a turban, featuring a thick, dark beard, and playing the role of the intellectual ambassador between Iran and India, as François de Blois calls him. Since we're looking at a key moment with respect to the transmission of knowledge and its assimilation into a new patronage and ownership, what is missing in the Yari Danesh scene is, of course, the presence of the book itself, the object of translation. And we've seen otherwise in the Latin manuscript where the book was very much present there. The lack of a visible book converts the picture into a conceptual image of the idea of the silsila of wisdom. The whole painting becomes an allegorical scene of a subliminal transference and exchange. A more tangible rendition can be seen in a copy of the Anvari Suhaili, which is the Timurid version of Kalila and Dimna. And that was made for Prince Salim, who's the future Emperor Jahangir. In this illustration, the ruler holds a closed book in his left hand, most likely of the newly written fables, and with his right gestures towards the author translator Borzoya, who puts his hands together and bows humbly. The comparison of the Yari Danesh painting and that of Salim's Anvari Suhaili further leads to the question of portraiture. examining closely the facial features of both rulers sitting on the throne, an interesting parallel appears that may shed light on the identity of our king and prince. And I'm going to compare this figure here. Compare with a picture that has been recognized as portraits of young Akbar, we can see very clear similarities between these two figures. And look at the eyebrows, the kind of very specific nose and mouth, and here are things that you can do with PowerPoints. So you can really see the similarities between them, but also look at the age difference, the kind of light beard that he has in the Yari-Danesh illustration, so probably in terms of time of depiction. It seems clear that the ruler in the Yari-Danesh is the Mughal Emperor Akbar in the guise of Khusro Anushirwan, embodying the philosopher king, whose reign is considered to be the high point of the Sasanian Empire. Both Anushirwan and Akbar were known for their love of philosophy, especially Indian philosophy, science, literature, and history, and they held philosophical debates or discussions at the court. They both commissioned the translation of texts from Sanskrit, Greek, and Syriac into Pahlavi or Persian. Moreover, by ordering the translation of the text from Borzoye or Abu al-Fazl, Akbar aligned himself with the Iranian king, following his prestigious footsteps. Looking at the figure of Anushirwan in the Anvari Suhaili picture, we may further recognize the portrait of Prince Salim, which is the future Jahangir, inserted into the composition. So again, we have this classical father and son competition between Akbar and his son. And the reason for the Anvari Suhaili painting picture blurry is not because of my bad image, it's because it's covered with a piece of gauze restoration to that manuscript. Now, the Anvari Suhaili is a very interesting manuscript on its own right, since it belongs to works of art that were produced in Allahabad when Prince Salim rebelled against his father, Akbar, and established himself there in 1599. The striking difference between these two scenes, which were both painted in Mughal India only a few years apart, is very telling. Look at how specific the Yari-Danesh picture is, yet so precise, with all its vignettes and action. The complex, almost chaotic painting with masses of figures wearing magnificent clothes, beautiful carpets, gold vessels, peacocks on the roof, an elaborate architectural setting with grand gestures of the personages involved, and the dramatic diagonal line of the composition. Look at what's happening here. Stand in sharp contrast to the stifled and focused, somewhat somber illustration from the Anvari Suhaili. An important and similar celebratory moment of the book presentation was recorded at the Akbari court in a painting now housed at the Chester Beatty Library. This time, we witnessed the author himself, Abu al-Fazl, holding an open book of his Akbarnameh while conversing with the emperor. And you may further think about this painting in the context of authors' portraits, continuing in a way similar medieval traditions that Eva Hoffman discussed in her article. To add another layer to the complex Mughal temporal lapsus and the conflation of Anushirwan Akbar and Borzoye Abu al-Fazl, I would like to go back to the text of the Yari-Danesh, and let me take a short detour. As mentioned earlier, the fables of Kalila and Dimna were translated from the Sanskrit Panchatantra book into Middle Persian Pahlavi. At that time, other Indic materials, such as the stories from the epic of the Mahabharata, were added to the book. How is this relevant to the Yari-Danesh? When Akbar commissioned Abu al-Fazl to translate again the Kalila and Dimna tales, the latter was already deeply engaged in various other translation projects. Among them were the renditions of sacred Hindu texts into Persian. Recognizing the religious Sanskrit source of some of the Kalila and Dimna legends, Abu al-Fazl writes in his introduction to the Yari-Danesh that he translated some of the narratives from their Indian originals, and here he refers back to the Mahabharata. So when he identifies the Hindu stories, he went directly back to them. He also mentions that he used the Arabic text of Kalila and Dimna and not the existing Persian versions of Nasrullah or Kashafi. Displaying his cultural persona within a multifaceted society, Abul Fazl makes a strong statement about his awareness of transmission of the stories, their origin, religious connotation, and their own voyage back to India. On that level, he skips the Iranian mediation of knowledge, replacing it with his own world. Yet the manuscript ends with another self-conscious statement, in the form of the portraits of the calligrapher Abdul Rahim Haravi and his assistant. Abdul Rahim was among the renowned calligraphers working at the Mughal atelier. He traveled from Iran to India and was active at the Royal Kitabkhane from about 1590 to 1624. In about 1604, Akbar granted him the honorary title of Ambreen Kalam, Amber Pen. This is a sophisticated and playful painting. It captures not only the calligrapher and the process of, hopefully, finishing copying the text, but if we take into consideration Abul Fazl's words, comparing letters to a portrait of wisdom, we have a complex painting that involves the semantic relationship between text and image and its agency. By depicting the one who physically generates the text, the calligrapher is immortalized not only via his letters, but also through the painted figure of his own likeness, made by an artist. The idea of revealing the main creators of the manuscript on its last page can be linked to the completion of the book and the end of Borzoya's journey. In a broader context, books symbolize the mobility and persistence of knowledge. The addition of images of authors, scribes, patrons, or great masters as part of the manuscript body legitimizes the process of transference and connects the depicted figures to a prestigious silsila of men of learning and ancient knowledge. Similarly, the Iyari Danesh interrelates Borzoya, the author, and the patron, King Anushirwan, in the guise of Akbar, who is also the patron of the calligrapher. Likewise, in the colophon, Abdul Rahim completes the cycle through copying of the stories, which will, in turn, be presented to Akbar. In contrast to the tumult of the first painting, at the end of the journey, the figure of the calligrapher appears to be peaceful and serene, which is the state of mind that knowledge is supposed to bestow upon the reader. In the end, a sense of order prevails versus the chaos of the beginning. This is the completion of the passage of the book from Iran, Central Asia, back to India. The association between India, translation, and the self-fashioning of Persian elites was discussed recently by Barry Flood. Interestingly, the Iyari Danesh makes no mention of a patron in its colophon or elsewhere in the book. In contemporary historical sources, Abul Fazl specifically mentions that among the illustrated manuscripts in Akbar's Kitabkhane were the Book of Kalila and Dimna and the Iyari Danesh, possibly referring to our codex. Considering the fact that Akbar's portrait appears on the first illustration, the calligrapher on the last, as well as the depiction of Mughal court etiquette and the choice of the new rendition of the text, I propose that this manuscript should be seen as part of the Mughal effort to construct an intellectual identity in a pluralistic society shaped by the Mughal view of transcultural knowledge. Thank you.
Questions, please? No? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question for both of you, but I suspect Amanda will be the one to answer it. I'm wondering about the Kingdom of Navarre and the pivotal role that it played in geopolitics right, and the political game in Europe at this time, especially its queens. As a queen, right, was the commissioner of this work, do you think that it's placing herself and her kingdom as the mediator in this translation, or in this act of translation? That is, Navarre was the conduit to peace, literally, in the region. Aragon was always attacking it. This is why the French, would wage war against them. Their queens were highly sought, by the English, the Spanish, and the French. So do you see any part to play here from the part of the queen?
I had that very question myself. And what stopped me from pursuing that avenue very far was that this particular queen, Joan of Navarre, was raised at the French court from the age of 3. And it's not clear to me what real connection she had to Navarre. So I was thinking about, I could look into who raised her, where they were from, whether they might have known the stories of the Kalila Wadimna. So that's an interesting avenue. I'm a little bit hindered because she's been in Paris since the age of 3. But yeah, I think you're right. I think that bears some investigation. Thank you.
I wanted to ask about when you suppose that Raymond might have converted, because in the presentation of the book, he's dressed as a Jew. And he has red hair, which was a sign of Judas and the whole linking of this to the persecution of Christ. And so I'm wondering, he's very differentiated from the rest of the people in the presentation. Really?
I hadn't noticed that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
And his headgear is different, and he's definitely shown as a Jew. So I wondered what evidence you had as to when he converted.
I've got absolutely no evidence.
Well,
it was just a question in my mind. Can you tell me again, you think it's the headgear?
There's a book by a woman named Ruth Mellenkopf about red hair associated with Jews, and that's widely depicted in Spanish retablos.
Right.
It's the headgear and the different dress, the much more subdued dress in comparison with the other people in the scene.
Thank you so much. I will look into that. I do know that he's been working on this book for a long period, like from 1303 up to 1313, and some pieces were certainly added in later. But I very much appreciate that comment.
Thank you. Other questions?
I'm just struck listening to this how little obvious place there is to ask a question to both of you, because one would have expected that it would be much more. And I liked the way that the panel was framed and the way Eva invited us to ask questions of both of you. And so my question is, where do you see the point that they come together? As I know that you have been talking about this work to each other. So where is that? Or have you been frustrated in trying to find it yourselves? That's my question.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that there is a larger point here, and that is the construction of rule and how rulers and rulership are constructed in terms of multicultural identities.
Well, that's exactly the point that we were thinking about together, but also the departure point for us was the kind of more medieval context of one manuscript and the kind of ideas of early modernism and that are formed in the Mughal manuscript and how they're dealing with these kind of issues through a similar text. So that was another connecting and disconnecting point for us.
Can I just push that one point further? and ask you how, if you think what the role of this extraordinarily wide dissemination of this particular manuscript, of this particular work, in 14th century France, in 16th century Mughal India, if this played any kind of role, do you think, in the illustrations here, in the fact that we have one in France and we have one in India? This, like, what is it about Khalila wa Dimna that has made it so widely disseminated?
Human nature.
Yeah.
I mean, they really capture the behavior, the essence of human behavior in such a particular way that I think that speaks in a global language that everybody understands in that sense. But also the Mughal, I mean, you see from the paintings and also the introduction of Abul Fazl that are very much aware of the spread and the breadth of that text and the stories. So there is this idea embedded there as well.
Yeah, no, I guess I would just echo that these are stories, well, about animals, but really about people. And people are fascinated by people, and they always will be.
Okay, and there is an awareness expressed in the text of this dissemination. Thank you. Okay, we'll...
Sorry, I had one more, is it possible?
Oh, one more question. I'm so sorry.
It was actually a question for Amanda. I was just curious. You were talking about Borzoya's conversion, presumably from Islam, and this whole undercurrent about the Crusades and so forth. And the fact that in the introduction to the Khalila wa Dimna, it's clearly mentioned that it comes into Pahlavi, and that Borzoya presumably then was Zoroastrian. He's presenting it then to Anushirvan. Was this lost in the Spanish translation? I was just a little bit curious about that. Is this something that was lost from the Arabic version into Hebrew and then Spanish?
Well, there's absolutely no mention in my manuscript of what religion Borzoya was. It is presumed, I think, that he was no religion. Now, of course, if anybody had the knowledge we have today, that would not have been a realistic assumption. But that is the way my manuscript sort of posits it. He had no religion, and he went in search of one, and he found the Catholic faith.
Okay, I'm afraid we have to end the questioning now and then continue afterwards with additional questions for Amanda and for Mika. Thank you both.